Welcome to the realm of magic and mystery, classic horror and sci-fi. You are now entering the House of the Unusual podcast with your hosts, Eddie and Joe. Welcome, everyone. I am your host, Joe Pavlansky, pop culture historian, writer for Story Monster magazine, and curator of the Crypt of Classics. Co-hosting, as always, is the maestro of mail order mysteries and owner of houseoftheunusual.com, the intrepid Eddie Guevara. Tonight's special guest is a legend in the mail order novelties world, former member of the Johnson Smith Company and key designer behind many of the items and catalogs that you know and love, Craig Tarbeck. How's everyone doing tonight?
I'm doing fine.
Great to be here.
Well, it's about time we got you on, Craig. We had some technical difficulties the last few days. Eddie's calling it the Craig's curse.
All right. Well, I'll alleviate that curse. Let's get it on.
All right. So what's on everyone's mind tonight? What's new?
Well, I wanted to have Craig here because obviously, as the story goes with Craig, I've been hunting him down for years, and finally, from 1985, when I first sent him a wine bottle as a gift, 10 years later, maybe 15 years later, I drove 359 miles to have lunch with the guy. He was a legend. I grew up buying his products, and he's also he coined the phrase "things you never knew existed" from the Johnson Smith catalog. That later on it was known to be part of a very new Johnson Smith catalog. They actually named the catalog "Things You Never Knew Existed." Other than that,
Eddie, don't forget the second part of that name: things you never knew existed, and other items you can't possibly live without.
There you go. So go ahead, Joe. Take it over.
All right, Craig. Well, we know you work for the Johnson Smith Company, so you want to give us a little background of how you got started there and what you did during your time at the company for all the people out there that maybe are not familiar with you or with the company.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Johnson Smith Company started in 1914 in America. Actually, Alfred Johnson Smith, the originator of the company, just one man, Alfred Johnson Smith, was an Australian, and he had started mail order rubber stamps in Australia and then branched out into some merchandise there. But he realized that Australia in 1914 was a very small market. So he decided to come to America and to Chicago. Why Chicago? Because that was the home of Montgomery Ward's and Sears and Roebuck, the two biggest mail order companies in America. Mr. Smith knew that he could not really compete against those companies because they sold everything that you really needed. So he decided to sell stuff that maybe you didn't need. And in 1914, he progressed very well into the 20s, but during the Depression, he actually went bankrupt. He had printed a 6 catalog, which he sold for 3 cents, but it didn't sell because of the Depression, and he couldn't pay the printer and had to go bankrupt. But what he did was he told the printer, I will pay you. Give me a chance to reorganize. And they said, okay, but you need to come to Racine, Wisconsin, where they were, the printer. And so he moved the company to Racine, Wisconsin. And as the Depression wore down, Johnson Smith began to make some money, and he paid off the printer and all of his debtors, which he wasn't really required to do in a bankruptcy, but he paid every penny back to the printer and his vendors for the products that he had bought. And in the late 30s, Johnson Smith began to take off. One of the things that helped the Johnson Smith Company, was the arrival of comic books. And comic books were preceded by the 10-cent pulp novels, which was, printed on rather pulpy paper, and Johnson Smith had been advertising in it. But comic books came along, and 1938, the very first comic book ever published was an Action Comics Superman title, and Johnson Smith had 2 full-page ads in that comic book. By the way, if you could get a copy of that particular first comic, it's worth millions. But the comic book advertising was a lifeline for Johnson Smith Company for a long time. At one time in the 40s, 50s, and even into the 60s, the comic book publishers distributed over 100 million comic books a month. And so there was a very large advertising possibility for Johnson Smith and others. And Johnson Smith was in comic books all the time in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Alfred Johnson Smith, however, died in 1948, and his 2 sons took over the company and built it up with a strong catalog in the comic book advertising, and advertising also in Boys Life magazine at the time. And at one point, they actually employed over 300 people. But come the late 60s, towards 1970, one of the brothers retired, and the other one, Paul Smith, who was really the brains behind the advertising and the catalog, decided that he too wanted to retire. He had a manager of the company that wasn't doing very much business at that time, and he really kind of let it go because he didn't need to work that hard anymore. He had plenty of money in the bank, so he could retire. And the company was kind of small. About that time, 1970, I was teaching school. And I thought, gee, what can I do on a part-time basis? And in the summertime, teachers needed to find something to do in the summertime. I thought, well, I'll start my own mail order company. And so I began to research mail order, came across a trade journal for that industry, and sent off for a subscription to it. And one Saturday morning, I went. This was in Detroit. Now the Smiths had moved from Racine, Wisconsin, to Detroit, basically in the 40s after they got out of bankruptcy, because Mr. Smith, Alfred Johnson Smith, was still a citizen of the United Kingdom, having come from Australia, and he thought if he was close to Canada that he could bring some goods in from Canada into Detroit, which are right next door to each other. So I'm in Detroit as a school teacher, and one Saturday morning, I went downtown Detroit to file my business, to name my business, to get a license, and for $3, I got a business license for Tarbeck. On the way home, I stopped and ordered, because the books that I had read told me to get letterhead and envelopes, and I stopped at a printer and ordered my letterhead, Tarbeck products, and gave the printer a $10 down payment and said I'll pick it up when next week and start my business. I had no idea what I was going to sell. Got home from that printer on a Saturday afternoon, and there was the first edition of the trade journal to which I had made a subscription. And Saturday night, having, as usual, no date, I looked at the classified ads, and there in the classified ads was an ad that somebody that wanted a experienced copywriter and marketer to come on board. Now, I didn't know who it was. I didn't even know where they were because I had to reply to a post office box in St. Louis. So I wrote a letter and decided to sell myself as a mail order product in this letter, money back guarantee type stuff, not knowing to whom I was writing, frankly. And I sent off that letter. And 10 days later, Johnson Smith called me. They were, as it turned out, in Detroit, very close to where I lived. And they liked my letter. And they liked the fact that I had been a school teacher because a lot of Johnson Smith customers were young folks. And they hired me in 1970. So that's how I got there. And at the time, the catalog was all black and white. Let's see, I guess, Eddie, you'd have been about, 10 years old then?
Actually, I was 5. 6.
5, okay.
6, yes.
6, all right. Yeah, so it was a couple years before. I don't know, you might have, by the time you saw the catalog, it might have actually had a few color pages in it, which I brought to it. So the rest is history, and I worked there for the next 38 years.
Now, when you got hired on in 1970, did you start off full time, or did you start off, as a part-time gig, and eventually?
Well, yeah, good question. Actually, what happened was that letter that I sent to answer the ad was kind of late in the year of '69. And I interviewed with them in January or February of '70, and they wanted to hire me right away because Paul Smith really wanted to bow out, and he wanted somebody else to do the catalog and the ads. And I said, well, I can't really leave my job as a teacher because, I'm committed to these kids for the school year,
right?
So I can come in June full time. They asked me to start in March, part time. So I would go in sometimes after school or on a weekend and start learning the ropes of the mail order novelty business.
So what were some of the main products that you started to work on while you were there? I if I remember right from us talking, you were involved with the 7-foot Ghost and a few other products that got pretty famous.
Yeah, well, of course, most of the stuff was already there, Joe. The main thing I had to do was I don't think they actually printed and mailed a catalog for over a year, and so my first job was to redo the catalog, put items in that we found, or take items out that were no longer available or weren't selling or what have you. So I spent the first 6 months basically until Thanksgiving redoing the catalog and getting it on the printing press and mailed out. The best season in those days for mail order was winter. you wanted to be in mail, and at least for in January. And the reason is because people got money for Christmas presents, and we sent the catalog in on January and hoped that they would spend their Christmas money with our catalog. Right, Eddie?
I'm
Right,
sure
well,
that's Eddie.
when you're saying
Right.
when you're saying people, the people were in a pretty young age group, that's for sure. Um, Craig, one of the things that happened around the early 1970s is that the first item, of course, that I've always told people that I ever sent away for was for the 7-foot ghost. When I got married in 1984, the time between, the 1980, 1984, I got out of college. I had gotten out of NYU and stuff. And I had become a photographer, but you know what? I did nothing with the photography business. So I said, I would love to start a mail order business. And that's when I started with the books and stuff. And one of the first things that I did, which was so funny, is I wanted to reproduce the ghost that was sold in the 70s. Because I wanted to turn over from the mail order selling books in the mail to, novelties and stuff like the ones from the time of the comic books. So back in the day,
Eddie, was Johnson Smith still selling the Ghost in the mid '80s when you decided to do that?
Johnson Smith was selling the Ghost, Craig, from like 1970, late 69 was like the first time they started it. Which, if you remember when we discussed it, I think they actually, the person that started selling the Ghost was in 1966. And it was John Cook Productions, I think, of Bobson. It was in the Boys Life magazine. Then in 1969-70, Johnson Smith and the Melton Company kind of started selling it at the same time. Then Honor House followed, and then, of course, J. Marr, the Fun Factory, which later I got to own. And the whole thing was, though, in the 1980s, this is the funny part about it, I got a hold of, somehow I called Johnson Smith. I forgot who I spoke with. I think it was Dominic. And before the second time I called back, I spoke with a lady who got me in contact with Craig. And Craig was kind of like a little too busy, a little young kid calling Craig. Craig wasn't going to really, he was a businessman, had really little time to talk to me. But the day I got you on the phone, Craig, which I still have that original fax, I asked you about the Ghost, and you said to me, well, you know what? We sold a lot of them. You said we sold hundreds of them, but some people complained about the way it was made. And you said, but hold on. So you put Dominic on the phone, and Dominic broke down all the parts where I could get them, if you recall that.
Now that has to be, Eddie. That would, we moved to Florida from Detroit in.
That was in 1984, 85.
No. Well, what happened was it had to be 86 or later, Eddie, because we moved to Florida in 86.
Okay, you're right. Because I started with 1984. You're right about that. So
yeah.
you had just moved to Florida, because I remember you telling me we just came down to Florida, and you still had to go back for a reason and move down. So I think you were this. So then it was, you're right. It was 1986, give or take. So what happened is that somehow you felt, you started talking to me. I said to you how I like to sell the Ghost and everything. And you went inside, you looked somewhere, and you found in a folder the original instructions for the Ghost.
Which I don't think we were selling at that time.
No, at that 86, no, you weren't selling. The Ghost, last time Johnson Smith sold it, I believe, was 1981.
Right.
So what happened is you sent me a fax of the front of the instructions. And then I thought you were going to send me the second part. And what I did is I said, wow, he didn't send it to me. I got all excited. I wanted to see the back part of it. So I called you the next day. And it was kind of funny, though, because you must have thought for a second to yourself and said, hey, did I give this guy too much information? Maybe, my company is going to get in. So you said to me, Eddie, I really don't want Johnson Smith to, getting mad at me for whatever reason. And you said, I think what you have is okay. But I'm saying to myself at the time, this guy has no idea how bad I want the other part. So as the story goes, I got I still have that original fax. So the actual date on it that we are speaking of would be on that fax, which I need to just look up. And it's kind of fading out a little, but yes, I still have that original fax and letter that you faxed to me. What happened about a week or two later, I sent you a bottle of wine, which I believe I called you back 2 weeks later and you say, yeah, I got it. Paid very little attention to me, just the fact that I was happy to have met, whatever. So what I think really was, I made it important because I kept contacting you. And what made the contact between me and you great was when I joined forces in 1989 with Lou Wise, and you had told me the story that Lou Wise had tried to hire you and bring you over to New Jersey for the Fun Factory. You kind of took you looked at me in a more serious way. And then I guess when I drove that 359 miles to basically have lunch with you and explain to you how much of a legend you were to me, that's when we became really good friends. And I am so glad for that day. So basically, I do treasure all that stuff. And I do have that original letter you sent me and all the contacts, which at that time, if I'm correct, the balloon was purchased from the National Latex Company. The control line was Mason Tackle, who had sold it, and the sheets, which unfortunately at the time were not being sold anymore by the company who had them, that you had given me the connection for. So what happened with that situation was that I had to improvise, and at the time I was forced to buy half a ton of plastic in order to be able to reproduce the ghost. So since I couldn't really, not that I couldn't afford it at the time, it was like $700 for half a ton. I didn't have the space where to put that. So what I did is I found some pallet covers that were sold by, I think it was called Fidelity Office Product, which was a good, and it happened to be 60 by 60 inches square, not the exact 84 inches that the original sheet was, but it was good enough to start selling the ghost. And I bought a roll for like $59 that had, I guess, 300 sheets per thing. And let me tell you, I went through like 2 rolls, and my early ghost was very barbaric. Doing the paste stuff, you're talking back in the early 80s, no computers. In fact, it was all like, you cut and paste, and then you took it and you did it. Very, very tough to do.
You cut up the plastic by hand, Eddie?
Yes, I did. It was kind of it was crazy because it took me a long time, but I said to myself, I have to sell this product. And then the greatest joy was when, at the time, I had Lou Wise, of course, Lou Wise was with me, and then Lou Wise and you started one day, had a conversation, and together, I was, a little kid among 2 of the legendary mail order guys that were still around and had basically sold all the comic book stuff we grew up in, But the thing that was kind of funny, though, is that both you and Lou had done it for business. You were not a collector. You were just selling regular products. What made me stand out from you guys was the fact that you guys sold the products, but I'm the one that fell in love with the products and kept them. So my history became, with the products, I became an expert on the products, asking you people that information. But I had the love for it, and I stayed with those products for the next, to the present time, which I have amassed a collection like no other. And
I must admit, Eddie, I really wasn't.
Craig?
When I was a kid, I was not a customer and had never Johnson Smith, although I did buy comic books. I never sent away for anything from Johnson Smith when I was a kid.
Johnson Smith, the one that stood out for me the most is I asked you that and you didn't remember. And I wanted to get that information from you because in 1970, the 7-foot Frankenstein and 7-foot skeleton were first advertised in the Johnson Smith catalog. The one that had the 60th anniversary issue on it.
That was
became
74.
Right. That was 1974. I thought it was 1970.
No, because 1914 is when Johnson Smith started in America. And so the 60th anniversary would have been 74.
Okay, 74. So the one that has it's the cover that has the ghost in the front, and
Right.
it has the original. You know how you remember the ghost? Was really tall and stuff. And that's when you told me that the horror record that's sold by Johnson Smith, the famous horror record that goes for $100 whenever it shows up on eBay, you're the guy that does the screaming on that.
That's right. I did that in a audio place, a recording studio. And when I did that scream, the guy in the control booth, I almost blew his ears out.
and that was really interesting because, believe it or not, remember that there were two versions of the record. I think one was stopped. I forgot because it had something in it that. Well, I have 6 copies of it. I have both versions, and 2 of those copies are actually with the ghost embedded in a display case that I paid for, and they put it in there.
Right. Let me tell you something. Eddie, you were obviously one of our best customers, but there are many customers who also became famous. For instance, Johnny Carson bought his first magic trick from Johnson Smith Company, and he said many times on his show that because of Johnson Smith and magic, that's why he got into show business. He's one of many people like that. Another famous customer of ours was Steve Wozniak. You know who that is? He is the co-founder of Apple Computer, along with Steve Jobs. He was a customer of ours. Another way back in the 20s, Henry Ford II, who was the grandson of Henry Ford. Can you imagine? I don't think that Henry Ford II had to sell papers in order to get money to buy stuff from Johnson Smith, but he was a big customer when he was a kid. went on to become the president of the company, Ford Motor Company.
The thing that's interesting about it with the mail order industry, when the mail order industry, the novelty business really took off, was probably in late 1968. When Honor House came on the scene, they pulled a lot of customers away. And in fact, like I was saying to you, the origination of the 7-foot Frankenstein and Boney the Skeleton was Johnson Smith. Honor House swiped at it. Remember we had that conversation one time from you guys?
Yeah.
You guys never did nothing to them. They swiped it and just added an order form in the bottom, a coupon that looked like a coffin, kind of.
But I probably wrote him a letter and told him to stop it.
Craig, if that letter was written, he never acknowledged it because that ad ran for the next probably 10 years. And,
I think I probably told them they had to stop using my copy.
No, they kept the same copy from the Johnson Smith, and you can tell that if you look at the catalog. I think I sent you a copy of that catalog, the 1974. We were talking the 60th anniversary. They spelled the word. Whoever did the spelling spelled the word awful, AWEFUL, and it stayed with that same mistake throughout the Honor House, through the present. That was never corrected. That mistake in the print where it says, just imagine your friends if they walk into your room and see, the Frankenstein bit, whatever. And but the whole thing is that Johnson Smith had sold a lot of stuff, and Johnson Smith, especially if you remember when you told me about Johnson Smith sold everything from the Pointer products. The thing with Johnson Smith, they had so much that I think Honor House pulled away a lot of their customers because Honor House had the biggest blow. What's the best way to say? The biggest puffery in advertising between the two companies. They were
Uh-huh.
able to grab kids. In fact, Honor House started in 1947. And as they progressed, they had earlier in their history, they had catalogs. And their catalogs were like 40, 50 pages. And what happened was that they found that the catalog was not making as much money as when they started doing 24 by 22-inch flyers printed on both sides. And I
Yeah.
got directly that from Mr. Wagman, who explained that to me in 1987, 88, whenever I first met him. I went to see him in 1985 when I was looking to see who would let me use the ad copy so I can start my own mail order business. And when I got there, he asked his secretary for me to write a letter to meet him. And I'm like, I'm out here. Can he just see me? No, he made me go home and he made me write him the letter. And the
Yeah.
next 4 times that I met with him, literally, I had to write a letter each time. And it was kind of crazy, though, because I realized how much Honor House had. And one of the things that Honor House did that really generated a lot of money was when they started selling the 7-foot submarine. They started in the 1950s with the rocket ship, or late
Mm-hmm.
60s. And then the rocket ship went to the tank. And the tank ran for a year or two. But when they hit the sub, man, the sub became so popular that there's 2 episodes on television today that actually use a storyline from the submarine. One was the uh, what is the CSI New York season 8, I think episode 4. There's a story behind the submarine there where supposedly this guy wanted to kill a magic shop owner. And the reason he wanted to kill is because when he was young, he bought the submarine and his girlfriend and him went out to the thing and she drowned or something. So he wanted to get even, which was funny. But the funny thing behind it, and also SpongeBob SquarePants, the funny thing behind both those the cartoon and the actual CSI is that they used an actual ad from Fun Factory. And I'm like, whoa, that's my thing. I should, because, I did obtain all the copyright for that. And I'm like, I should actually call them up on this because, they just put it. But of course, I didn't do that. But the thing I'm saying, though, is that that's how popular it became. So Honor House, their majority of the business was the 7-foot monsters and the submarine. Their
Right.
Ghost was a good seller, but Johnson Smith outpulled them 10-1 on the Ghost because they actually, it was more predominant. Like if you looked at a Johnson Smith ad, right next to the coupon was the 95 cents Ghost, and it looked better.
Yeah.
I was in love with the Honor House ad because I think it left more to my imagination. And then
Uh-huh.
you had the Melton Company come on board and forget it. That guy, man, he grilled the pages with the Ghost and the Bat and the 7-foot robot plants I never ordered that I'm still in search for to this day, that we spoke about that. But the whole thing is that, having said that, it was amazing the amount of people that must have ordered that. And that also amazes me that today, after 38 years of looking for this product, there's none left. But then again, it was so flimsy they will make a balloon. I mean, the first time I actually put the Monster Ghost to use in Honor House, the head blew up in about 2 hours later. So,
Yeah.
it's not going to last. And if you remember the submarine, um, it
But I
was
don't think we ever sold that.
no, that was strictly Honor House, and they did it in Long Island. There was a company in Long Island that used to make corrugated cardboard displays for trade shows,
Yeah.
and they made the sub, they made the tank, and they made a few things from them. And I actually found that information out a few years ago, like 10, 11 years ago, what company had made it for them, because Dan Goodsell, which is a good friend of mine, and he's also, he does a famous cartoon called Mr. Toast, and he's pretty famous with that. He actually had bought a binder in some warehouse or some novelty shop, and inside the binder there was displays, and there was an actual picture of the Honor House tank, and he was able to let me get the picture, and I scanned it, at a 100% resolution on that. So I was able to get the picture of what the actual tank looked like. The whole thing is, though, that what the whole deal was is when I went, and I was telling this the other day, that if you remember, you said that Johnson Smith was the first company that ever run an ad in any publication of comic books. And if you remember, we spoke about this, Craig, one time a few years ago, me and you. Fun Factory was the last company that ran an ad, because if you remember, Craig, I had mentioned in one of my last podcasts, when Harvey Publications in early 1980 started running Harvey Comics again, Casper and stuff, Johnson Smith ran a full page ad in back of those comics for like a couple of months.
Yeah.
And they ran it, if you remember that, because obviously I think you must have been in charge of doing that. And,
I was.
And the price was astronomically great. I remember it was like $750 for like 6 months. And I was like, what? So a few years after that, maybe 3 or 4 years, because I was in the early 80s, whatever, me and Lou Weiss ran an ad through Bernie Slotnick. If you remember Bernie very well, he was, of course, I'm sure you know Bernie. Bernie
was that DC Comics?
Yeah, DC Comics. Bernie Slotnick.
Right.
And right. And then his niece is actually the one in charge of advertising for Archie Publications. And what happened was that I went to see Bernie Slotnick with Lou Weiss. At first, when I tried to run an ad, forget about it. They wouldn't even talk to me. It's like, well, because I'm a newbie. They don't respect people coming in the industry. When I called up the guy, they ran the ad on him like in 2 seconds flat,
Yeah.
So I was able, if you remember, see, Blue Wise had a guy who actually started the American Circle Corp of the time.
Right.
And his guy was Bob Levy, and he owned Filer and Levy Advertising in Fifth Avenue, New York. And him and Lou had started the Fun Factory in 1969 or 1970. And Lou Weiss did it, obviously, because that's when he tried to hire you, because he did it because he saw how much money Johnson Smith was making. So based on that, what happened was that I was able to get an ad in the comic books with Lou. And I made sure that the ghost appeared there. So that's the one thing that and it made it. And of course, it was kind of funny though, because Bob Levy used the photograph of the Johnson Smith for that one, but when that happened,
was that DC Comics, Eddie?
Yes, it was DC Comics.
Right.
And it appeared in the 93 edition that went on sale it's the February issue of DC Comics.
In what year?
I think February, January 1993, and it went on sale December of that year. So it has a Christmas theme on the cover. Any Superman DC Comics from that year has my full page ad inside. Bernie Slotnick said to me, it's been 10 years or about 10 years since anybody ran a novelty ad in comic books.
Right.
And that was Johnson Smith. So basically, I was the last person with Lou Weiss that ran in these, any comic book ad.
Well, we stopped advertising in the comics because they weren't really working, frankly. And the reason for that was that kids were, instead of buying comics, basically they were the new computer games were so popular. That's where they were spending their time and money, not on comic books. So we didn't have any luck in comics. I think after the mid 80s.
Well, Craig, if you remember, you guys started going into the wrestling magazine when wrestling was becoming very popular.
The what magazine?
And ads, wrestling, all the different wrestling magazines. Do you remember that era?
Yeah, I do. Uh-huh.
Okay, you guys started running full page ads in the wrestling magazines. But you know what, though? Here's the catch. A lot of people don't know this. Maybe you recall, a lot of people tell me no, and I know it as a fact. Between 1981 or 1982 and 1984, there was no such thing anywhere in New York or New Jersey as a comic book store, except, and in fact, comic books used to be sold in 5 and dime stores, and they stopped selling them all over.
What I said, at one time, they would do 100 million comics a month. And then in the 80s, it went to basically nothing.
That's what I'm saying. A lot of people don't know. And you know what's stayed popular? The Archie Digest that you would get in supermarkets.
Right.
And they kept publishing. But here's the thing. When comic books started again, like early 85, I think, that they started going to all the stores around, they took off, man, with a passion. They took off where they started. I mean, stores started springing up everywhere. People started collecting comics like crazy, and the price. And then in 2000, when eBay came out, no longer did you have to, look through Toy Shop magazine to buy collectibles. All the stuff that I had in my collection, everything just flourished and quadrupled in price.
Right.
I started selling some of that stuff, like an original Joy Buzzer today from S.S. Adams. Probably does an easy almost $100 if you get in the original box.
Well, let me ask you this. Eddie, because you're up on it and I'm not. Where can you find novelties like we had in the 60s, 70s anymore? I mean, where do you find that stuff? Who sells it?
houseoftheunusual.com.
Yeah, right. right.
The good plug there.
Right.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's a that's a very good plug. You're right, Craig. I still, well, thanks to you, you connected me with quite a few people, such as Morris Costumes, where you introduced me to them.
Yeah.
And I was able to talk to the owner directly. Loftus Novelties, Rhode Island Novelties is still around.
Mm-hmm.
Franco America, if you remember, Bob had a heart attack and unfortunately the guy passed away.
The Franco's gone. They're gone. Yeah.
Yeah, they're gone.
Right.
Rhode Island Novelties. You have Eddie's Tricks in Georgia.
Right.
Of course, Morris Costumes still sells all the original stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, S.S. Adams, which finally they got smart and they figured, let's license out our products and let's get rid of making the products in America because they couldn't compete anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And so, Chris and Dave, which Dave, by the way, is going to be in next week's podcast. They closed down the shop and they sold the licensing to, they still own the rights to S.S. Adams, but they sold the licensing to, I think, Magic Makers. And Magic Makers is making a lot of those novelties. Now, of course, because of eBay, all the 1970s novelties are still being sold. The X-ray glass. In fact, right now, one of our friends that we've had in the last two episodes, actually last week's episode, his name is Todd. He's working with Yolanda, Harold's widow.
Right.
And they're bringing back, and this is going to make you laugh, some of the products that Harold had put out.
The Sea Monkeys?
Well, yeah, the Sea Monkeys are repackaged. They're now called Executive Sea Monkeys or something. I don't want to say the product now on the air because there is a product that you're going to laugh at that they're bringing back, but I don't want to because it's actually on the way and it's not finished yet. I don't want to, divulge information we're not supposed to right now.
Yeah.
But, it became what it is now. The truth is that most of the products, from the X-ray glasses, which are still obviously being produced, I'm actually probably the one selling most of the originals. I still have in my possession quite a few, and just recently found out that one of them is going for over $500 on eBay of the original. When it had in the back, instead of Transscience Corporation, it had Honey Toy Industries.
Mm-hmm.
Which it was, when Harold first used it back in the day.
Right.
Now, I got my original X-ray glasses from Johnson Smith, and when you guys sent them out, they were not in the header. They were like in a plastic sleeve with a rubber band around it. And obviously that's the way it was sent. But I have a question. With everything said and done, not a question, it's more like a statement. I think what happened with Johnson Smith is Johnson Smith ran their ads, and they were such a huge company that they sold, and regardless, they didn't really concentrate on specific products. Honor House, not having a large variety of products like they did in the 40s, because in the 40s they were very competitive with Johnson Smith. They only, and in fact, most of the orders that you would order from Honor House wouldn't even have a catalog inside.
Yeah.
That was a rare treat. So when you got one, you're like, wow, because I ordered like 20 times from Honor House. And I gotta tell you, I only received 2 catalogs.
Mm-hmm.
So that tells you that they really didn't, because they were selling, and the majority of the company was making money with just the submarine, and I think those are monsters, because that was the main. And of course, they sold that 8mm projector, which was also a very popular thing they sold at the time. But you know
Well, our
what?
philosophy was to run a comic book ads and the Boys Life ads and send along a nice catalog with a lot more products for people to choose something from. And
That is correct.
that's how we ran our business.
Well, one thing I wanted to tell you, Boys Life, believe it or not, stopped advertising products like in 1991.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
92, when the internet took off pretty strong, they kind of, not 91, I think the Boys Life, it's still in 2003, was filled with ads. And you got to remember this ad, which I think it ran for 40 years. Ross was the owner. I actually had the privilege of talking to the owner, and I found his phone number a couple of days ago, which I said I should call him. I guess he's still alive. You remember the hovercraft plans that says you can float on air?
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. He ran that for years, and he was a scientist, I think, that worked for NASA, or an engineer.
Uh-huh.
And I spoke with him, and I remember him telling me, I said to him, do you make a lot with that ad? I mean, so many years. And he goes, it pays for my car each month.
He was really selling paper. Basically, there was very little cost of merchandise there.
Yeah, he was selling the plans.
Yeah, so he sold these plans, which cost him 10 cents to print, and he was selling it for $5.95 or whatever. That's not a bad markup.
Yeah, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not at all.
And then he offered you an inventor's calendar, which, believe it or not, never changed. I actually ordered that 6 times, the same plans.
Oh, really?
I found his envelope. Yeah, I found his envelope last week. Inside the envelope, there is 6 of those plans he sent me, including the one that there was a follow-up that showed you how to build the jump house,
mm-hmm.
like one of those bubble jump houses.
Right.
So yes, I also spoke with him. I was fascinated because I always wanted that as a kid. And I got to tell you the honest truth. And it told you that in order to build the device, you had to use one of those old Electrolux vacuum cleaners, like the ones from Abbott and Costello's time.
Mm-hmm.
And believe it or not, I still have an original vacuum cleaner I bought in a flea market with the hope of building that one.
Really?
I have it here. I have it here, believe it or not. And well, anyway, the point is that it was a different era. It was a great era. It was a great time. And one of the things that, that Craig is going to be really exciting, and I know Lou Weiss is looking for this, is when I'm going to have you and Lou Weiss discuss, maybe in the next couple of weeks, of course, in an earlier, time zone, discuss between both of you, why was it that companies like Johnson Smith and stuff, chose children as your main customer, Like, what was it that made those companies sell to young kids? I know Lou Weiss said to me, because they don't question you,
Mm-hmm.
They just order. And back in the days, I guess, you could get away with ripping off the poor little guy, right? But the thing that's so funny is that you have no idea, including a famous guy who wrote a YouTube video called the $1.25 Ghost. And if you look it up, his name is Kevin Noltz. I think he works for People Magazine. He's a publisher somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And he explains the $1.25 Ghost, which obviously he bought it later in the early 80s, because the Ghost went from $1 to $1.25 in Honor House. And he says that the fact that he was so conned, he says, and with a tear in my eye at the end of the video, he says, I said I would grow up someday and become an advertiser so that I can make someone feel as deliciously conned as I did. And you know what, Craig? That's what makes me who I am today.
Right.
That conning they did to me, the anticipation of things that I made up in my mind I was going to get, and you guys sold to me, but never really delivered. I got to tell you the truth. That's what made me who I am. And that's why my love for mail order is.
Right.
It made me dream.
Yeah. Well, that's what we appealed to your curiosity. That's really what it was. You you weren't, like I said, Eddie, Johnny Carson, Henry Ford II. Lots of people who later went on to become quite successful. Had been Johnson Smith customers. They were they were smart folks, and their curiosity drove them to wonder, well, what's this? What's this X-ray glasses?
Well, you know what's really crazy when you're saying that, Craig? One of my customers, and I just wanted to put this in, is the guy the producer for The Walking Dead. He purchased from me a few of the life-size posters about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he bought all of them.
Right.
And I've had J.J. Abrams, the movie producer. He purchased, I think, one of the items from me as well. But the problem is that I found out because when I called the one person, they called me up and they said they want to know what the price you're going to give them. And then the lady told me who it was, and I was like, "Wow, that's amazing."
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same thing you're saying, Craig.
Right.
Well, I always kind of looked at it as almost like an addictive drug. You were curious about the item, you received the item, and you were kind of disappointed. But then you looked at the ads, and you're like, "Okay, well, here's another item. I'll try this out." And then you got that item, and you're like, "Oh man, I'm disappointed." And the cycle just kept going over and over, and you just kept wanting to buy more. And then as you got older and you kind of took that nostalgic look back, you're like, what, these items were pretty cool.
Is you know what it is? We didn't know any better, but I didn't even know what it was to get gypped off or conned. But you know what? I still wanted to order. Now, we only have about 5 minutes on here, so we got to kind of wrap it up. And what I wanted to say, Craig, is first of all, thank you for being part of my life for so many years, my friend. You know how I always bother you, and you've helped me through my copywriting. You've been kind of like a father figure to me, actually. And I appreciate that, my friend.
Yeah.
And also, there's so much that we could tell about the Johnson Smith Company and your history there. And like your wife told me the story about her and you and everybody working in Johnson Smith, including Dominic. And you know what? The whole thing is that down the pike, it's been a great 40 years of my life.
Mm-hmm.
That I can 48 years, 40, actually 50, because I'm 56. So I started when I was 6 years old buying. So it's been 50 years, let's put it that way. And you know what? That's actually what made me and kept me out of trouble as a young kid, is constantly wanting to buy things from comic book and chasing the mailman down.
Well, I have a question. I have a question for you, Eddie. When are you going to finally grow up?
I think that will never happen, Craig. Not at 56. I'm now I find myself being my grandson's play date. He's got me playing with it's so crazy. He's got me running around with guns like cowboy and Indians. I mean, the things you do for your grandchildren, But anyway,
right.
It's almost like now we're even more of kids because now we got money. We have money, so we could even buy more products and toys to play with. So it's we've never grown up. We've just become
right.
bigger kids. Even more of a kid than we were when we were actually kids.
Right.
Well, the thing that when you hear the story of Lou Wise, you're gonna make you laugh the way I tracked him down and
Mm-hmm.
basically hounded the guy until he finally went into business with me.
Well, it sounds like that's what happened with Craig.
Well, actually, yeah, I did kept bothering Craig, and you have big business people like that, and Craig, being in charge of a huge company like that, he's not gonna care for a little guy calling him up about 1970 products.
Right.
But over time, he's the greatest person, one of the greatest persons in my life today, and I'm glad to have him as a friend.
All right.
So anyway,
well, thank you, Eddie.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yep, I'm here.
Say the last thing because we got about 2 minutes to go. Closing statements.
I got a story for you. One of our bread and butter items was the whoopee cushion, and I think we were probably the first to introduce that in America back in the 20s, if I'm not mistaken, long before I was born. But Alfred Johnson Smith wrote a great line, which was gives the whoopee cushion gives forth greater noises better imagined than described, because he didn't want to use the word fart, which in those days was not acceptable, I guess. But anyway, in the 80s, Eddie, I don't know if I told you this, but I think I told Joe this. I suddenly we suddenly couldn't get a hold of whoopee cushions. I mean, we bought hundreds of dozens at a time, and it was a bread and butter item for us. I couldn't get it. Nobody had it. The major importers didn't have it. And I asked Franco-American Bob Umano. I said, Bob, what's going on with how come you don't have whoopee cushions for me? And he said, well, the AIDS scare is causing people to use latex in condoms. And so there's no latex available for whoopee cushions. And I think we probably had to take it out of our catalog for a couple of seasons.
Well, one thing I'm going to tell you really quick, Craig, about that is, that's why one of the reasons I think SS Adams, when they made their raspberry cushion, it was made of vinyl. It wasn't even latex. But having said that, we're right now 3 minutes away from the end. So I'm going to say again, thank you, guys. Craig, I hope we can again in the future have you on board again. And I like to have you and Lou Weiss this time talk with each other, which that will be, I think, fascinating for our listeners. I mean, I was fascinated when you guys carried on a conversation when I had a three-way calling. I wish I would have recorded that. And having said that, well, listen, Joe, you want to say anything now as we close?
Yeah, I just want to say, Craig, thanks again for being on the show. There's a lot of great information out there, and I'm sure our audience, if they've never heard it before, they're going to be fascinated, and hopefully it prompts them to do, their own research and get involved with, mail order novelties, and it might, spark a little flame in them to get interested in the hobby as well. So just want to thank you for being on, and Eddie, thanks again for being on, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Good night, guys.
All right.
Had a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
All right.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye now.
Bye.